Hello Year 4, I hope you're all okay. Today in history we're going to be learning more about the Anglo Saxons today. We're going to be exploring what everyday life was like in an Anglo Saxon village. So first of all, by the end of this lesson you're going to be able to explain where the Anglo Saxons chose to live. You're going to be able to explain the different jobs that the Anglo Saxons had. And you're also going to be able to look at a picture of an Anglo Saxon village and use this to make connections with what you already know about them to be able to describe what village life was like. So to start with, we have our retrieval questions here. I've just added in red here some little sentence starters to remind you of all the different types of the groups of Saxons that there were. So if you just pause the video and have a go at these retrieval questions, please. Okay, so number one, which areas of England did the Saxons settle in? I wonder if you can remember that the East Saxons settled in Essex. Just pop all the answers up here now. The West Saxons settled in Wessex. The South Saxons settled in Sussex. And the Middle Saxons settled in Middlesex. So you can actually see that you've got kind of the way that you can remember it is by looking at the first letters, because East begins with an E and Essex begins with an E as well. West begins with a W, Wessex begins with a W too, and you can kind of make that connection, all right? Number two, what alphabet did the Picts and the Scots use? The answer is B, the Ogham alphabet. Now, the reason I put Gaels in here, because what connection does the Gaels have to the Scots? That's right, the Scots were normally called the Gaels, weren't they? And what connection does the Pictish have to the Picts, do you remember? Well done. So the Picts and the Scots both used the same language, which was the Pictish language. Finally then, number three, the land that the Picts lived in was not called Scotland at the time. Now it's called Scotland, but when the Picts lived there and when they controlled the land, it was called Pictland. Okay? So well done for remembering that. So we are going to look today about where the Anglo-Saxons lived. Now the Anglo-Saxons preferred to live in a very different environment to the Romans. We know the Romans had established these large towns in Britain when they were ruling it, and during the Anglo-Saxon times, places that were really thriving and doing quite well during the Roman era, such as London, for example, became much smaller and quieter during the Anglo-Saxons times. And they actually left a lot of buildings to just rot and become ruins and not be existing anymore because the Anglo-Saxons didn't want to use them. And instead, the Anglo-Saxons chose to live in these small villages, so in huts like these. And these villages were often set up by clearing away a part of a forest, so maybe cutting down the trees and building some really little huts and villages instead. And we're going to be learning about the different parts of an Anglo-Saxon village today. The Anglo-Saxons liked to move out into the countryside and build lots more smaller houses, because with smaller houses came more land, and more land meant more area and space to build these crops and to plant them and make lots of food and lots of different resources that they would really benefit from. Because we know that the Romans, one reason why the Romans had to leave Britain is because they spent all their money on these expensive things, on the army, so there was really little money left for anything else. So when the Anglo-Saxons came along, they wanted to be a bit smarter and more efficient, and they wanted to actually do things right so that they would be successful, unlike the Romans. Now, the Anglo-Saxons chose to create their villages from their own sources and not use the towns or the facilities that the Romans had spent so long and spent so much money on trying to establish. I want you to just have a think. Why do you think that the Anglo-Saxons didn't want to use what the Romans had already built? Because surely that would be easier for them. But pause the video and have a think, please. Okay, so you might have said some similar ideas to what I'm about to tell you, but the Anglo-Saxons, they wanted to start again. They wanted to just make this village their own. They wanted to make their Britain their own place. They didn't want any remains of the Romans being there, because it would mean that they were quite competitive, and it would mean that it wasn't their own, was it? And the Anglo-Saxons didn't want to use the same towns or the buildings that the Romans had spent so much time and effort producing, because it would mean that it would almost damage their kind of ego in a way, that they wouldn't have they wouldn't have built it themselves, and they're now living in something that the Romans had built, so that they might feel a bit embarrassed about that. So it was all about looking good, basically, which was a bit like what the Romans was about too. But to the Anglo-Saxons, although they had smaller buildings and smaller houses, which we'll see in a moment, it was still about making sure that they looked good, and we'll see how they did this in a moment. Now, in an Anglo-Saxon village, they had lots of different jobs, and each person had a different job. There were some jobs that were just everyday jobs that a lot of Anglo-Saxon people did, which include like clearing and ploughing the ground. So that means that they're making the ground ready for crops to be planted. Also, another job that they might have done was grinding flour and making bread out of it. So they'd use this flour and make bread because obviously it was a really good source of nutrition for the Anglo-Saxons, and also quite cheap as well. So they had lots of workers doing that too. They also had workers growing crops, so when the ground was ploughed and ready for the crops to be planted, they grew the crops and they tended to the livestock. Tending to the livestock, what do you think that means? That's right, so when you tend to something, you're looking after it, and the livestock would be the animals on the farm, so like you might have pigs or cows or chickens or sheep, for example, and they would look after that livestock and they might do other things with it too. We'll find out what they did with it in a little while. So those are the more general jobs, but some people who were experienced had more specialised jobs. So you had three types of people who had specialised jobs. These first people were blacksmiths. Now blacksmiths, what they do is they make things out of metal. They might burn the metal to shape it and put it into a different order, and they would use this to make tools and weapons. What do you think they needed tools and weapons for? Absolutely, they obviously needed it to fight, to have a really, really safe and secure army. Well done. They also had people that were woodworkers. So woodworkers, they made bowls, wheels and furniture, and this helped the Anglo-Saxons a lot because it meant that they didn't have to buy it. They had these experienced people to make it for them, so they saved a lot of money. And finally, the jewellers, who made brooches and ornaments for the rich. Why do you think they only made them for the rich? Jewellery. Yeah, so the rich looked better, didn't they? What other jobs do you think needed to be done though? Because there's some that we haven't actually mentioned yet. Can you pause the video and have a think? Okay, so some other jobs are jobs that were specific to men and women. So we've already talked about ploughing the fields, that's what men did as well. Chopping down trees, they fought in the army, and they made weapons from metal, and they went hunting and fishing. So that's what the men usually did. I want you to think what types of jobs these are though. Are they jobs that are hard? Are they jobs that require strength, resilience, for example? Women, on the other hand, did the everyday jobs, so the rest of the jobs associated more with the household, such as weaving baskets, making them, knitting clothes, making pots from clay, and preparing the food, along with other jobs too. Now this is quite similar to the Roman life. If you remember, in the Roman times too, men and women did have specific jobs, didn't they? They had specific jobs that they had to do. And that is the same here, where the men usually did the handiwork and the women did the house chores. Do you think that's fair? No, I don't think it's fair. I mean, some women might have really enjoyed maybe going in the army or hunting or fishing, but it wasn't allowed in that time, and that's not very fair. Here is a picture of an Anglo-Saxon village, a typical one, what most of them would look like. I want you to pause the video and see what can you see. Make a list of 5 things that maybe we could learn about Anglo-Saxon life, and we're going to look through them in a moment. So if you just pause the video and have a think, please. Okay, let's make our way around the village and find out what each of those things are. Even though the village looks pretty sparse, pretty empty, there's a lot of things going on here that made it really, really successful. So first of all, they positioned their villages near somewhere where they could get water, such as a river or a lake. Now this would provide them with drinking water and also fish to be able to eat. So they're also saving money by having to have these things. They also had a large house in the middle of the village. Now, this house was for a very important person, the chief of the village. The chief of the village is the person who's in charge. Now, they lived in this house in the middle of the village, but it also was a house that could be used if the Anglo-Saxons were having a feast or a celebration, or also if they had to have a meeting about something. If they were going to go out to fight, they had to have a big meeting. They would go in the larger house, the chief's house. They also had lots of fields. So we can see over there, you can see some animals, and there were lots of fields there to grow crops, which were ploughed. So they were getting ready to be able to grow these crops, preparing them for planting. The family groups lived in the smaller village houses. Now we're going to look at the smaller village houses in a little while. We're going to be looking at how small they are and how big of a family has to live in them. So I want you to just bear in mind about these houses for a minute. They do look small, and they normally have a family of about 4 who are living in there, so it's quite cramped, and we're going to see more about those in a little while. We can see here over by the chief's house in the middle are some pots. Now these pots are made from clay, and they were basically fired on a large open fire, which means they were dried out and hardened so that they could use them for various things. They might use them to store their food or to pop other things in there. That will just make sure that they're really saving their money and spending it when they need to spend it. You can see here that there is some livestock here. There are some pigs. Now the pigs and the livestock were often kept in the village. The children would often be responsible for looking out for wolves, and you'll learn in a moment that the children as young as 10 would be sent out to work and be hunting for these animals. And that's what the children would be prepared to do. They would have to look out for these wolves, because during these Anglo-Saxon times, the wolves and other animals were really, really hard to capture and to hunt. So they sent the children out so then all the other Anglo-Saxon people could actually get on with their other job. So the children would have that job because it's not as hard, as in harder than creating metalwork, making metal, for example. And finally, I think some buildings were reserved. So they were reserved for specific purposes, such as performing a craft, such as weaving, or for storage units. So there's always that extra space for the Anglo-Saxons. Now, I want you to think, what does this make the Anglo-Saxon? How does this make the Anglo-Saxon look? Does it make them look quite clever? Does it make them look quite ambitious? How do you think that makes them look? I agree. I think the way that they've organised their village makes them look really, really clever, really strong and united as a group of people, and they've done it in a really, really smart way. They've got their chief in the middle, and they've got their fields, and they've got everything else that we spoke about too. Now, as I mentioned before, the children on the farm were treated in a very specific way, and it was really tough for them because when they were young, as 10 years old, they'd have to go out and work. And it was very, very rare that children would go to school. Children would only go to school if they had a rich family, because you'd have to pay for a teacher. Schools often didn't really exist, which meant that most Anglo-Saxon children could not read or could not write. Okay, now imagine that. If you can't even have an education, you couldn't read or you couldn't write because your parents couldn't afford it. Not only that though, most Anglo-Saxons had to eat things like cereals, bread or wheat, fruit, vegetables, because they were really, really easy to grow, because they couldn't really always eat meat, because killing an animal was too expensive, and hunting animals was too difficult. It took too much time. So a lot of the time they had to eat things that were easy to grow. Okay? Now, I want you to have a think, what is happening inside this house? I said before that most of the families live inside a house like this. There's lots going on here. What can you see?